We know, first of all, that today the FDP, SPD, and the Greens decided to discuss forming a government. Armin Laschet said clearly that the CDU is available for talks, but the CDU did not have the best election result. I don't think I need to add anything to that.
German Chancellor Angela Merkel speaking there. My first guest tonight sees the erosion of popular support for the CDU, Germany's traditional conservative big tent party, as a bad omen for Europe. In an opinion piece in the New York Times this week, author Christopher Caldwell argues that with the CDU's loss in last month's election, a pillar of the European order has collapsed. He writes that with the CDU's defeat, something larger than Angela Merkel's 16-year tenure as German Chancellor is coming to an end. Christopher Caldwell joins us tonight from Washington, D.C. Mr. Caldwell, it's good to have you on the program. The conservatives, the CDU, they're beating at the ballot box last month. Why is this not simply the story of a political party that just lost its connection with its voters?
Well, I think it is that. And you know, when we say that it's a problem for Europe, it's a problem for Europe as it exists now. But there's a lot of dynamism in European politics, and people obviously do want a change. You know, there was a sort of a conflict between the CDU represented a couple of things. It represented stability, and it represented familiarity. The German voting public now is turning towards different things. There are certain people who want more of an EU role in what Germany does. There are certain people who want less, who want a more traditional kind of sovereignty. That would be the AfD. And there are certain people who want a little bit more attention to climate change. Now, up till now, Angela Merkel had offered them a certain amount of familiarity and a certain amount of seniority in governing structures that consoled them for a politics that was a little off of what young people wanted. But now voters have shifted, particularly young people, and we're seeing a different kind of politics.
You focus a lot in your article on German Chancellor Angela Merkel. She's been Chancellor for 16 years. She outlasted, 4 U.S. presidents, numerous French presidents, UK prime ministers. And we were looking at the leaders who have held on to power as long as Merkel are Russians Vladimir Putin and Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. These are not exactly the torchbearers of democracy. Would you say that Merkel maybe was in power too long? Are 16 years in power unhealthy for a democracy?
You know, that's a complicated question. We've had, we had a president elected to 4 terms. There have been a lot of European leaders elected many times. It can be, but I don't know that it necessarily was in this case. Merkel would have been reelected most likely had she run. I think that her politics actually found an interesting middle ground. I mean, I'm reminded a little bit of the 1957 CDU campaign slogan, which was "No experiments." Merkel was a kind of experimental politician, but she had an anti-utopian side, like her CDU forebears, and so she wound up with a slightly experimental government that Germans wound up liking.
Well, let me ask you a little bit about that. She is accused of appropriating the center-left and policies, or even the Greens policies, into her own CDU policies, which at the time, many times, has been called ingenious. But on Election Day last month, it proved to be the worst thing she could have done. Do you agree with that?
This, too, is complicated. Yes, I think in a way it was the worst thing she could have done, but for a different set of reasons. When Merkel started out, there was an idea of the CDU that was still kind of intact, which was that it had a destiny to be the rightmost party on the German political spectrum. That and as such, it had a very, very moderating, anchoring influence on the country. Merkel, though, decided to use that as a liberty to move to the center, assuming that no one would take the votes on the right away from her. Then she had the immigration crisis of 2015. You had the AfD began to stress immigration in a very, very resounding, straightforward way, and she proved wrong. And you wound up with almost 100 people in the Bundestag who were to the right of what Germans were used to thinking of as the rightmost edge of their politics.
But Mr. Colorado, that was 2017. In this last election, the AfD, they didn't do very well, especially in the federal parliament.
They lost votes, but, they lost votes, but they have moved. There are a couple of things that have become apparent in this issue. One is they are a national party. They're getting 10% in a lot of districts all across the country, unlike, for instance, the Left Party. Mm-hmm. The other thing is that they seem to have strongholds in a couple of Eastern Länder, Saxony and Thuringia. So you're right, it was not. You cannot draw a simple mathematical equation and say everyone who left the CDU wound up in the AfD, right, the way some people thought you could in 2017. Yeah. But the AfD is, I would say, much more securely anchored than people thought it would be 5 years ago.
Well, let me ask you about Merkel and her conservatives, this notion that they have been too cozy with China, for example, and also refusing to stop the Nord Stream 2 pipeline with Russia. The Greens, for example, who will most likely be in the next German government, they are against Nord Stream 2, and they are hawks when it comes to China. Do they not strengthen Europe more than Merkel's conservatives ever did?
Well, I think they strengthen the European Union. The Greens have always been a very firmly pro-European party. So, for that matter, has the CDU. But there are certain stumbling blocks on the way to further German participation in Europe, and they're mostly of a financial nature. Last year, the spring of last year, you had Germany took part for the first time in a jointly financed European bond for the COVID emergency funding. That was a major threshold for Angela Merkel to cross. I think that the Greens are quite comfortable with it. I think the CDU is uncomfortable with it, and I think the Free Democrats are quite uncomfortable with it. Yeah. And I think that will be at the heart of a lot of the coalition negotiations coming up.
Yeah, and since we're speaking of European pillars, an EU summit today wrapped up with disagreement on practically every issue on the agenda. And our Europe correspondent, Barbara Vasil, she joins us now from the summit venue in Slovenia. Barbara, it's good to have you along tonight. But before we discuss this EU summit, you've been listening to my discussion with Mr. Caldwell. Let me get your reaction.
I would say to some points objections, Your Honor, particularly the idea that it's Angela Merkel's fault that the AfD developed on the extreme right in Germany. Which center ground political party in Europe would be able to sort of straddle the extremes from the very right to the very sort of more left and sort of take it all in and just pull it all together in one big vote? It is impossible. And we have seen in many other European countries that the political landscape has become so scattered, so fragmented. Look at the Netherlands, look at Scandinavia, look at Italy, look at the total disappearance of the traditional parties in France, for instance. And it becomes quite clear that the past is the past and that we are just going into a totally different political future that demands different sets of compromises, that may demand a different personality than the one that Angela Merkel has very successfully shown on the European stage for 16 years. So this future is in an unknown country, and we will just have to face it. And there are many facets. You mentioned China, the foreign policy of the EU will have to evolve. It simply will have to. Otherwise, the EU will run into grave problems. And there is a long list of those topics that just need to be tackled now. And somebody else needs to do that, somebody other than Angela Merkel.
Mr. Caldwell, what do you say about that? I mean, what Barbara is describing here is a German political system that has become like the rest of Western Europe. And isn't that a good thing?
I don't know. I'm talking about Angela Merkel and not about the system as a whole. But I would say that in moving to the center, I would say that Merkel actually abandoned that role of straddling the center and the right. What she did embrace was, yes, I would say a more European logic. There is a logic in a lot of countries now of the grand coalition. The Macron movement, the La République en Marche, is a sort of a coalition of groups of the former of former Social Democrats and former Gaullists meeting in the center. The Biden coalition, to the extent that it has picked up a few anti-Trump Republicans, is also a centrist formation. I quite agree about the logic of Europe, but I still think there are possibilities for center-right and center-left parties.
Let me pull Barbara back in. Barbara, you and I, we spoke countless times in the past 5 years after the Brexit referendum. Mr. Caldwell writes that Angela Merkel's 2015 decision to allow Syrian refugees into Germany, and I'm quoting him here, drove Britain out of the European Union. Is that how it's seen from where you're standing?
Let me stifle a little shrill squeak here, because I believe that there were many aspects driving Britain out of the European Union, particularly from within the United Kingdom. It was British exceptionalism. It was, of course, the Polish plumber and the Lithuanian truck driver that they would in Britain so urgently get back now, who were sort of painted black by a certain populist strain in the Conservative Party. There were many aspects. There was particularly this one big lie by Michael Gove, let's remember, who said that the European Union wanted to bring in Turkey into its folds, and with it, like millions of Turks who would then flood the United Kingdom. That was the threat that was painted on the wall, and not the Syrians. None of them ever made their way to the UK. So I do disagree on that point, Christopher, very sorry to say so. And I believe that Angela Merkel had particularly nothing to do with it, because she looked at the British government and she recognized that she could not keep them, that you could not keep people from traveling who really wanted to go on a voyage. And therefore, she didn't invest more and more heavily into the project of keeping Britain in the EU. She thought it couldn't be done, and yes, she was right in the end. It could, in fact, not be done.
Let me just throw in one more before we run out of time. The issue of the transatlantic world. Mr. Caldwell, I'll ask you: what is the weakest link right now in the transatlantic alliance? Is it a Germany without Merkel and the conservatives in power, or is it the United States with the possibility of Donald Trump running for president again in 2024?
Well, it could be both or neither of those things, and a different thing. I think that right now, the United States is in a very difficult situation. It's polarized, as I'm sure I don't have to tell you. But the logic of the governing Biden coalition is beginning to break down. He's falling very quickly in the polls. And it's not certain that he can bring the left and the right wings of his party together. It's not sure that he can. It's not certain that he can perform that classic center-left straddling function that is the role of a Democratic president. So, you know, whether that's going to be a long-term difficulty, I really can't say. But it's a problem right now.
And I'll let you, Barbara, get the final word here. What do you think is the weakest link here?
From the European viewpoint, the weakest link at the moment are indeed the United States, because it seems so very uncertain where politics will go there. Whereas looking at the likely successor in the German chancellery, Olaf Scholz. I mean, he is as lacking in sort of temper and temperament and all the sort of arts, political arts, as Angela Merkel was. He is a sort of very solid, very serious, almost a dour kind of personality, and he will certainly keep the ship steady. He is not somebody who goes off on a voyage to utopia. He is not somebody who will make experiments that people can't follow. So it is going to be very straight on from here, but it will be different in a way. It will be more modern, and they will try to look more to the future and to anticipate future problems more. So it will be different, but in a way the same.
And I think there's going to be plenty of opportunities for us to get together again and discuss this. This is a story that has some very long legs on it. Barbara Vazel for us in Slovenia and Christopher Caldwell in Washington, D.C. To both of you, we appreciate your time and the excellent discussion tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.